Hello, everyone. Welcome to week 10. We're almost at the finish line. This week, I want to check in with you and talk about what we have coming this week, which is going to be chapter 23, chapter 1. And again, the newer version of the book they used to have reimbursement in a separate chapter, but now it's in the new chapter 1. So some of this may be redundant. Check through chapter 1. We're going to talk about principal diagnosis and some of the other things in a finer level of detail. But first of all, I want to say about that people's coding has definitely improved. I'm seeing a lot of improvement in the code selection, the sequencing, and attention to detail. And that's where we want to keep things going. So please continue to keep that improvement moving forward as we get into the last 2 weeks of the course. We're going to be talking about chapter 23, external causes of morbidity. This was a big departure for those of us who remember ICD-9. It talks about the story behind the injury. It talks about how it happened, where it happened, what the patient was doing, and what their status was at a time. And I remember when I first learned this, I thought it was a little bit ridiculous. One critical thing that I think will help you with this chapter is remember that these V, W, X, and Y codes can never, ever be the principal diagnosis. They're secondary codes that give us context to the injury or the condition that's being treated. And we'll talk more about that later in this week. A couple of things. Pay very close attention to the chapter specific guidelines that you're going to be introduced to in chapter 23, especially the rules for place of occurrence, these Y92 codes, the activity codes, the Y93, and the external cause status codes. The place of occurrence, the activity, and the external cause status are only reported at the initial encounter and only one of each. And we don't have unspecified codes when the documentation doesn't support them. So this is an area that a lot of people that are new to coding these external um, causes overlook, and they start putting them in on all the follow-up encounters and what have you. So slow down, double check these guidelines, and make sure you get it right. Now we get into more exciting things, coding and reimbursement. Chapter 1 deals mostly with inpatient prospective payment systems. So we're going to introduce you to the MSDRGs, what DRGs are, and why we care about them in the coding and reimbursement world. We'll also introduce you to the importance of documentation to support the correct code. We'll be introducing you to the 3M. I still call it 3M. The company is now known as Solventum, 3M/Solventum encoder. And you'll see how these ICD-10 codes are grouped and how that directly affects reimbursement. And again, the principal diagnosis, as we'll see again in chapter 1, is the reason why the patient was admitted after study. So if you keep that in mind, MSDRGs will make a lot more sense to you. And then continuing on the reimbursement track, one of the things we're seeing more and more of in this day and age is the hierarchical condition categories or risk adjusted payment models. And we used to call these Medicare risk. Now they're called Medicare Advantage. So basically, it's a whole different type of payment model that's also reliant on correct ICD-10 CM codes. So basically, we're going to be coding these things, and the overall codes affect the risk score. And in contrast to the fee-for-service model, where you're getting paid for in an outpatient setting, every procedure that's done, a risk-adjusted model is the patient's overall risk score. That goes to the payer and then the provider gets paid. One last reminder for you as we get into the last 2 weeks of the course. I think sometimes people that are new to coding, they get so consumed and excited about the new chapter specific coding guidelines that they forget all about the general coding guidelines. And we saw an example of that with the last EHR Go patient, right? Probable postpartum depression is not appropriate to be coded in an outpatient setting because we don't code those uncertain diagnoses in the outpatient setting. So please remember to follow both the chapter specific guidelines and the general coding guidelines. They're both important. You can't really have one without the other. Overall, I see everybody's skill in coding improving, and whether you're getting an A in this course or less than an A, you've got a lot to be proud of. Your things are definitely looking in the right direction overall. So please keep reading the guidelines carefully. Please read the chapter specific guidelines carefully. And if you have any questions, please reach out during office hours, Monday through Thursday, 2 to 3:15. That's all I have for you. Have a great week, and we'll see you online. Bye now.